Welcome back to Let the Journey Begin. We have another week of the Jenna and Alex show hosting today with a very special guest that we got to meet April 30th, and we're happy to have him here. But before that, we got a couple of foundation announcements. Continuing our summer of fun, we have our Angels baseball game. It's our Christmas in June fundraiser thanks to Rudy's Christmas trees, but we're going to take about 400 families out to Angel Stadium on June 26th. So if you don't have any plans, it's a Sunday. Bring the whole family out for a nice little tailgate under the big A. Good, clean fun with us from RSF, plus some of your friends from the community. So if you're not doing anything, check it out. We'll have details on our website, www.redsongbird.org. So hope to see you guys out there. Plenty of activities and plenty of other events to join on board this summer as we continue into the fall, and September will be addiction awareness, as well as October being mental health awareness. And we'll have some more events and campaign stuff then. But until then, we hope to see you at the baseball game. But Jenna, thank you for joining us. We've got a great episode today, a great guest. I've had the pleasure of picking his brain, one at the Las Vegas event, and then we joined together here in Orange County for lunch. And Dr. Barnard's got some interesting concepts that I can't wait for him to not only introduce, but have us kind of dig into those things. You know, there's this kind of notion in addiction, the two sides, one being disease and one being behavioral. And a lot of times the doctors, they don't agree with one another, nor do they kind of cross collaborate or cross communicate. So they kind of get stuck in their towers. But Dr. Barnard's going to help us build some of those bridges and see if we can provide some solutions today. So today we have Dr. Alan Barnard, the CEO of Gold Rat Research Labs. He's also a speaker, an entrepreneur, an app developer, all-around smart guy, and an author to round out his CV if he didn't have enough things. But I've had the pleasure of watching his keynote, which is about 25 minutes on YouTube around decision making and kind of how he came to the app development aspect, which is very fascinating. And he broke that down for me, and I'm happy to introduce it to you, Jenna. But Dr. Allen, welcome on board.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, no, we're super excited, especially with a potential opportunity that we're going to explore here, and we'll dive into that a little bit later into the show. But I had the pleasure of meeting you first at the Las Vegas event. Granted, I've played golf with your wife before, and that was the first time meeting her. And then who would have thought that she was married to such a smart man that could not only pique my interest, but having me wanting to come back for more. And not only that, but keeping my diagrams as a daily reminder of good decision-making behaviors. One question that I'd love to start us off is, how did you get into not only the engagement with Gold Rat, but just developing this passion around behavioral decision making?
Alex, I grew up in South Africa, and I've always been really curious about decision making and why good people make and often repeat bad decisions. What's the cause of it? So if you think about a bad decision, there's kind of three conclusions that you can reach. The first one is that when you see a bad decision, it must be an indication that there's a bad person. That's one option, right? And unfortunately, society very much treats us in that way. We treat ourselves in that way. We often jump to the conclusion that if somebody made a bad decision that negatively impacted us, or we made a bad decision, that we conclude that it's just a bad person. We might be a bad person. The second conclusion could be that when you see a bad decision, it's not a bad person, it's a good person, but they were ignorant. Now, that's a pretty easy one to test, because if you give them education, if you remove their ignorance, and you see the behavior changes, the decision changes, then you know it was because they were ignorant. By far, the majority of bad decisions are not because one of those two reasons. It's because good people have bad assumptions. And of course, the way that we grow up, the traumas that we experience, the events that we have to deal with in our life shapes what our assumptions and beliefs are. And that's something I realized very, very early on in my life, is that I started, I grew up with very little resources in South Africa, but always had this ambition and desire to make some kind of contribution. And I was very close to my granddad and, sort of asking him the question, how can I ever make a contribution considering the sort of starting conditions? And he gave me this book, the Marquis Who's Who book, about 40 years back. So I was about 10 years old. And he said to me, go and read these inspirational biographies of these people that made it onto this list, which are all the top performers in the world in the various aspects. And the one thing that struck me was nobody in that book had ideal starting conditions, right? They grew up poor, mostly their families had never had a person that graduated, like in my case. They often had learning disabilities and other major obstacles. And my conclusion from that was, it's not the starting conditions that matter. It's the starting assumptions that matter a lot. And then I read, Henry Ford's famous quote where he said, whether you think you can do something or can't, you're right. And I thought, okay, now we know in science that, assumptions you can never prove right. You can only prove it wrong. You can look at millions of swans and they're all white every time you check. And then can you come up with a conclusion that all swans are white? No, it just takes one black swan, to tell you that, no, it's not true. The same thing, I can grow up in a very poor community and I can say, well, my starting conditions is what's affecting my impact. It's, affecting my success or failure. It influences the decisions that I make. I only need to find one person that came from the same community that managed to escape and become very successful to disprove for me that the assumption is that it's our starting conditions. So that's kind of how I started, and I became very curious about decision making. And the first thing that strikes you is, we make thousands of decisions every single day. Kind of 35,000 is the common sort of number that people quote. And that can be really overwhelming. Until you realize that most of those decisions don't matter at all. What I eat, what I drink, how I get to work, how I respond most of the time. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but there's a few decisions that matter a lot. They are the difference between, success and failure. And specifically the two ones that matter a lot is ones that has a big downside if it doesn't work. If whatever decision that we've made to respond turns out to be unsuccessful, if it has a big downside, that matters a lot. I call them hell no decisions. Anything that has a small upside if it works and there's a big downside if it doesn't is a hell no decision. Stay away from those. They can ruin you personally. They can ruin the people that you care about and your business. On the other scale, there's the hell yes decisions, which is ones that has a big upside if it works and a small downside if it doesn't work. And that became my passion, is to try and understand, so what's behind this decision making, right? So if we start off with an assumption that people are good and that mostly good people make bad decisions, not because of ignorance, right? It's not that they're ignorant about that the fact that there's a problem or that the consequences of the problem is bad, or maybe ignorant of the causes or even solution. There's something else, and it normally has to do with some kind of fear that came from a trauma that you experienced earlier, a protection mechanism that you've developed that you don't realize you are actually in automatic mode. And the last thing I'll share just briefly as a framework for all the viewers and readers out there, there's this kind of mathematical formula that's really useful to think about when it comes to decision making, because it's a very complicated field. It's called E plus R equal O. So the E is for the events that we experience throughout our life, and they can be both positive and negative. If you're lucky, you get more positives than negatives, but everybody gets both positives and negatives. The R is for the response. And both your response can also be positive or negative. And then the O is for the outcome. So if you think about just what will happen if you have a negative event that happens to you and you have a negative response, you get a double negative. Those are the kind of hell no decisions, right? It's a really bad idea to respond negatively to a negative event. because all that you've done is you've just made it worse. What would have happened if you had a negative event but you had a positive response is you can almost wipe out the negative, right? It doesn't mean that you won't get sad or angry or disappointed with yourself or others, but it won't last long. So it's a great way to treat a negative event is to always think about how to respond in a positive way. Well, the other part is what happens if you have a positive event, but you respond negatively, right? Somebody gives you a compliment and your reaction is, what do you want? Right? It wipes out those positives. And then the last one is the positive event with a positive response. It allows you to capitalize fully on all those positive moments that we all experience in life. That gives you a double positive. Those are the hell yes decisions. And what I realized as we were studying it is that essentially what happens is the mistake that we make is we don't realize that we don't respond in 95% of the cases. We react. A reaction is automatic. We don't even think about it. And that as a result, often we overreact and we make bad changes or choices. Or we underreact and we don't make good changes or choices. So part of what my passion has been and the research that my research lab does is not just understanding why good people make and often repeat bad decisions, but to give them a simple way of slowing down their thinking so that they are responding, not reacting, and in the process, essentially discovering and overcoming limiting assumptions or beliefs, the ones that we call bad. And it's not bad because it's wrong, it's bad because it's not helpful, it's harmful. And that to me was a useful way of thinking about assumptions or beliefs. Don't think about them as right or wrong. Rather think about them as helpful versus harmful.
You just brought a question to my mind. So you're talking about we're having all these decisions having to be made, tens of thousands a day, right? And I'm going to cheat a little bit because I've talked with you about decision making. And I know that decision making falls in one of two stages, or the first one is more autonomous, call it, instinctual reactionary. And the second one is one where you have to apply a little bit of critical thinking, right? So throwing another variable. So we know that people in society are basically, system overloaded or shock overloaded with all of this stuff. From a marketing or advertising perspective, we know that we're hit with more advertising dollars than any other country. We know that everything's being programmed in one way or another to influence our behavior or our purchasing decisions or this or that. Do you believe that those, along with social media, have added to the effect of negative decision making because of the convolution, or added complexity now? Because, I feel like the whole E plus R equals O is a very basic thing. And if you keep that in mind, I think you're golden. The problem is that there's so many other complexities and things basically crowding you for your attention that you lose sight of what's simple. And that's why we see, when we're talking about mental health treatment, a lot of the coping skills and practices are, they're almost very basic when you look at them, but you forgot about them.
Yeah. Well, so firstly, let me give you a quote that has had a huge impact on my life. It's a quote by a French physicist called JeanBaptiste Marin. And he said that the aim of all science is to substitute visible complexity with invisible simplicity, right? So if you think about E equal mc squared, it's a really simple equation, but it explains so much visible complexity. When it comes to decision making, there's a huge amount of visible complexity. And the factor that you've mentioned is one of the things that make it easier for us to react rather than to respond, right? So if I'm constantly seeing an advertisement of a fast food chain, right? And one of the protection mechanisms I've developed to deal with emotional pain is that I reach out and eat something because it's a distraction at that moment, right? I'm not thinking about it. I'm not realizing that the short-term gain that I will get is small in comparison to the long-term negative, which is kind of the sign of any form of addiction or compulsion, right, is in that moment we make an automatic decision that we want the short-term relief from the pain or the trauma, and we essentially ignore the long-term negative consequences, even though rationally we are aware of it, right? But in that moment, we're in automatic mode. So there's that space between the event and the response or the reaction that's golden. That's our opportunity to slow down, and before we go into automatic mode, to think about it. And for me, it's about thinking about how important is this decision that I'm making right now. Now, for somebody that is not addicted to food, cheating from time to time with fast food is not a consequential decision. But if you know that that is your way of coping with emotional pain, then, cheating with that decision is really consequential. And that's the point that you want to catch yourself, slow down your thinking a little bit and say, let me think about this a little bit, right? Is this really helping me or is it harming me? If it's harming me, it's not that I'm a bad person doing a bad thing. There's a good reason why I'm reaching out. Is I'm feeling some kind of emotional pain that I need to protect myself from. And this has become my protection mechanism. I need protection, but is there any other way of doing it that is less harmful? Maybe I can meditate, maybe I can exercise. There's always other ways of doing it. And so that to me is the idea is, of course, yes, advertising and all of these things just make it easier for us to make those bad decisions. But there's that beautiful space between the event that happens. We get on a call with our mother or a friend or parent that's toxic, and they disrespect us, they criticize us. And before we know it, we're in front of the fridge and we're taking out a piece of cheesecake or beer or something else, right? And it's that moment when we're walking there that we have the opportunity to say, let me think about what I'm doing right now. And even if you can't prevent that and you're starting, you still have the time to say, what am I doing, right? Because there's the difference between opening up the pack of snacks and having the first one and then getting that release, feeling a little bit better, versus just keep on eating or keep on drinking or keep on using the substance, whatever your choice is, that gives you the relief. There's always those moments where you can program your mind to catch yourself to say, let me not go into reactionary mode where it becomes an automatic reaction. I want to slow down my thinking here. And then we've developed some simple tools that help people how to do that in a very practical way.
I love how you shared that. As you were sharing that, it reminds me of some of the language I utilize when working with clients in DBT, for example, with looking at their addiction, creating, how do we create that space between the initial thought and then the impulsive action? Yes. So some of that language is so familiar. And so do you think that your research can be applied to addiction in that sense? And what are ways that we can develop and support those skills?
I think absolutely. I think the first point where we start is to show, using that equation, how easy it is to have a negative response, right? And to remember that a negative response will never be helpful. It can only make things worse or much worse. But give yourself some credit. We give a simple example if we teach this to kids to say, you have a simple recipe to follow, right? 4 ingredients, 4 steps, 1 temperature setting. How many ways are there to get it wrong? It's a lot. How many ways are there to get it right? 1. And you have to pay attention, to make sure you do all 4 steps in the right sequence with the right 4 ingredients in the right temperature setting, and then you'll get the outcome that you want. So if you're not happy with the outcome, don't blame the event, blame your response, but in a positive way, to say that's the only thing that's under my control. And I think the second part where it's really applicable to addiction is to help somebody understand why they get addicted. Addiction is not the problem. It's my attempt to solve the problem. The real problem is the trauma and the emotional pain that I need protection from. And I've developed some kind of compulsive behavior or addiction to solve the problem. So I think that already is a big aha moment, when we work with addicts, is to say that you are trying to solve the problem. The thing is, because it's become automatic, you are no longer connecting the fact that the outcome that you're getting is not helpful, right? So normally we have a pretty good feedback mechanism. You touch a hot stove plate, you get burnt immediately. We can learn very fast that this is not a helpful response to do. But in real life, there's space and time gaps between the decisions we make and the outcome that we get. So the complications that we face, which we have to teach, to say, look, so the first thing is understand it's easy to make a mistake. Give yourself some credit and other people that hurt you. It's really easy to make a mistake. Most of the time, those mistakes are not coming from the fact that it's a bad person or ignorant person, right? It's coming from somebody that had a bad assumption. And most of the time, that bad assumption came from some kind of protection mechanism that they developed to deal with early childhood trauma, right? That we know about. There's no question about that from a scientific perspective. So it's understand that that's where your response is coming from. The mistake that we all make is we often react, we don't respond. We need to give you a simple way of slowing down so that you can respond. And what makes it tricky to decide? Well, two things. There's always at least two ways to respond. How do I know which is the best? Right? The first response is do something versus don't do something. That's the first option. Second option is do something versus do something else. Well, the other part that makes it tricky is not only that there's always two ways to respond, but that each of the responses have got their unique positives and unique negatives. And now I get stuck. I know that to stop smoking or to stop whatever I'm using, right, as a way of protecting has a positive, right? And it also has a negative, right? The negative could be my fear of the withdrawal symptoms. The negative could be my fear of losing the connection I have with the people that I formed bonds with that are also using this kind of substance. Stopping also has a positive, but also a negative, right? And the negative might be that if I simply stop tomorrow and in my subconscious mind, using the substance or having this compulsion as a way of dealing with stress, of dealing with the emotional pain, I can find myself in real trouble, right? I can move towards the issue of wanting to, self-harm. So that's another part of giving addicts some benefit, is to say, thank goodness you've had this mechanism. Yes, of course it has major negatives, but if it helped to stop you from making an even worse decision, thank goodness that you've had it, right? But it's kind of like a stupid friend that you have. At some time you realize, okay, they helped me at some point. They're no longer helping me. It's time to let them go, right? And it's that understanding and then combining it with simple techniques of how to do that. And one of our biggest breakthroughs was, our assumptions and beliefs are sitting in the subconscious mind. There's two ways to access the subconscious mind. And I'm saying this with the deepest respect, so I don't want to insult anybody, but one way is that you spend time with a psychologist or psychiatrist, right? And sometimes this could take years and you might still not get there. The other way is you are asked the right question. Just one question can transfer an assumption or belief from the subconscious to the conscious mind. We can't challenge assumptions while it's in the subconscious mind. So that's what I've tried to do with the method that I've developed in the app, is figuring out what are the most common mistakes that we make when we make decisions. And it turns out that there's just 5 mistakes. What are the questions we should be asked to help us recognize and avoid that mistake? And then turning that into a 5-step process. So if I asked you, for example, what is the benefit that you get from this bad habit that you've developed? Whether it's a compulsive behavior, whether it's losing your temper, whether it's reaching out to some kind of substance. That's in psychology a disruptive question. And we often get that in interviews when we ask somebody, so what's the positive that you get from this addiction or compulsive behavior? They say, I know. And then they give us the positive of stopping, because everybody asks them, don't you realize that there's a positive of stopping, as if they're ignorant or stupid, you know? So when you ask them, so what is this unique positive that you don't want to lose, that you get from this specific behavior? And then they might say to you, it helps me to cope with stress, or it helps me to cope with emotional pain. As soon as they answer that, guess what's happened? They've transferred that assumption from the subconscious to the conscious. And as soon as they verbalize it, but especially if they write it down in a workbook or type it into an app, guess what the mind does? It can't help us by asking, is that really true? And even if it is true, is there not another way of achieving that positive outcome that I want? And that's essentially what we've developed is a very simple process that somebody can go through. And all that we've figured out is what's those key disruptive questions we can ask them to help them discover and overcome a limiting belief or harmful belief.
Yeah, Jana, that sounds like DBT Light Therapy, huh?
Yeah,
like
it totally
a very
does.
short form, lightweight, easy to use DBT application. Because, I mean, for our audience, when I was pursuing therapy or looking into it, I tried cognitive behavioral, and I'm like, this isn't for me. I have somebody telling me how I'm supposed to think and feel, and that ain't going to work. And then I linked up with a gal that does DBT. And next thing you know, I was challenging myself on the why aren't I? Why can't I? And it really puts you in perspective of your own, call it merits and image. And that gives you a real look at yourself by yourself, you know, not a look from a third party perspective or somebody you're paying a bunch of money or whatever. But I love the fact of the notion we're writing it down because, you know, we're keen on writing stuff down, workbooks, journals, things like that, diaries. But when you write it down, I feel like it gives it a whole different breath of life. So I love how you point that out, and that's great. I got a question though. Is that part of the 5-step pro con cloud process that you've mentioned in your keynotes in your app before?
Yes, that's essentially what I did with my PhD. Is the hypothesis that I had was we could develop a simple process, and by simple I mean few parts and a very specific sequence of the parts, right? That's what I mean by simple. And I'm driven by another quote there. Most of the viewers and listeners would probably know about The Little Prince, that beautiful, children's book. It was written by Antoine de Perret. He had this amazing quote. He said, "A design is perfect, not when you cannot add anything more, but when you cannot subtract anything more." So, whenever I look at, if I'm asked to review a process and I see that the process includes, 10 steps, 12 steps, 15 steps, 20 steps, that's already a red flag. The chances that you'll get full compliance becomes basically zero. And that's why you find out that whatever the process is, if it's a long process, it takes a long time, especially if the steps are not very clear. There's many ways of doing it, and different therapists have different ways of achieving. All of that just adds to the very, very low success rate of that. And then when you add on top of that, that people that then don't succeed are left with a belief that it's them and not the process, then you've compromised one of the fundamental principles within medicine, which is first do no harm, right? And that's unfortunately what happens with many of the addiction programs is over time, to try and deal with more and more situations, they keep on adding more parts to it. And there's more ways to do each part. They don't realize they just dramatically increase the failure rate. And then on top of that, if I'm promoting my program and I'm really confident that it can actually help you, because under laboratory conditions, when it was facilitated by PhD, therapists over 50 sessions that lasted a whole year, and they then, wrote a paper and got a positive outcome, that's not real life conditions. right? You know that when you're treating somebody in real life conditions, you are lucky to get a few hours of their time, uninterrupted time, where they can tell you their story. So that's kind of what I try to do with the Procon Cloud method, is to look at all the other methods out there. It's kind of the idea of science, right? Stand on the shoulders of giants, pay respect to all of the work that is done before, but then really check. If you're still seeing a very low success rate, and the fact that people that try it are often harmed by it, right, because of this additional shame that they experience, especially if it cost a lot of time and money and their family was involved, there must be a way to do it much simpler, much faster, with no or very little cost. And that's essentially what I did with my Procon Cloud method. Is I first tested it in the private sector, where we used the methodology to help somebody deal with a negative event that has happened in their business, right? We're not growing fast enough, or, we're being taken out by the international competition, and I have to decide what's the best way to respond. Then we tested it with NGOs and capacity building organizations that are going into areas and are trying to improve the quality of life of people, right? Improving availability of water or electricity or food security. Again, there's some kind of negative event that happened. They are trying to facilitate all the key stakeholders to think through what's the best possible response and how can all the stakeholders help, rather than just pointing fingers to find who to blame. So we tested it there, and then we started testing it with individuals. First with, relatively simple issues like I'm overweight, or I'm not getting the grades that I want, or, my relationship isn't working out, and then started, increasing the severity of those events all the way to, cases that involve addiction or self-harm, etc. So that was the way that we went about over the last 10 years of field testing this methodology. Once we knew that these 5 steps really worked in a perfect environment, we started teaching others to see if they could facilitate the process. And once we were confident that worked, we then basically codified it into an app that you can download.
That's awesome. And on that, it's going to be exciting to see how the Red Songbird Foundation and Gold Rat will be able to collaborate to hopefully be able to evolve this app to really leverage it for the mental health community. And not only that, but also the substance use community, since we like to keep them under the one umbrella, but they are compartmentalized. But I feel like your app, with a couple of minor tweaks and changes for the audience, would be extremely beneficial. And for our audience, definitely stay tuned while we develop that, because we might have a cool tool for you guys out there. But Dr. Barnard, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we're running out of time for this episode. We'll have to get you back, especially as the collaboration gains traction. Because I feel like, and I'll speak for myself, and Jenna can chime in after, but you bring a lot of great points to the table, and a lot of things that I think people were aware of, but subconsciously, and now we're bringing it forward, right?
Yeah, just a lot of the information you shared is so applicable just to my life, and then being able to parallel that just to those potentially struggling with addiction or mental health. So something that we like to do is ask our guest what an action for the day is for them. And so just simplifying, if they're trying to find the solution of whatever issue or problem or stressor they're having in their life. Very simple. What's one thing that they could do right now?
I think the simplest thing to do is, make a list of current negative events that you're experiencing and positive events, and then to write down what's your automatic reaction and make a judgment call as the outcome of that reaction. Is it positive or negative? And if it's negative, think about what would have been a better response.
That's brilliant. I love that. So if people want to learn more about you or follow you, Dr. Barnard, where can they find you?
dralanbarnard.com is my website. We also have a YouTube channel under dralanbarnard.com. And then the app, for those that want to try it, it's a free app for 30 days. And then after that, it's just a subscription of $2 a month, which we donate to our foundation. It's called Harmony Decision Maker. There's a lot of resources that come with the apps, training videos, some testimonials of how people have used it. So that's available in all the app stores. Just type in Harmony Decision Maker. And the name Harmony is simply coming from the fact that we all have these dark clouds that hang over us, right? And that if you could find a way of evaporating those dark clouds, that's the way to bring back harmony in your life.
That's great. Yeah, so check out his app, check him out, learn more about him. We'll definitely have him on our show again to pick his brain even further. But thank you again, Dr. Barnard, for joining us. This was a great episode, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.